We just came back from the October 4th CSU board meeting, and we have summarized the important points to inform you students about. So let's get into it. What happened at this board meeting? The first exciting thing to inform you students about is there has been funding approved for a new couch in the Queer Resource Center. By the beginning of the spring term, we'll see a shiny new couch in the Queer Resource Center. There are some typical items like appointments to board committees, both for students at large and regular board members. The item that had the most discussion was the executive portfolio critics and abolishing the board accountability policy. There was over 30 minutes of discussion about this. So this originally came up in the CSU board meeting 2 weeks ago, but it was referred back to the executive committee for further discussion before coming back to the meeting today. The president, Angad Brar, put forward this motion. And when speaking to this, he said he put forward this motion because these executive portfolio critics were made by the previous board during their last meeting after the results of the election came out. So it's clearly political and will create blocks for the new board to do their job. He also pointed out how there hasn't been any issues with quorum with this board, and a lot of the last board was re-elected. So if this decision was made for a good purpose, it should have been made during their first term or their second term. And this is the reason he gave for wanting to abolish the executive portfolio critics. So the Board of Governors representative Sophia Cara brought up points about how the last board experienced issues with executives not meeting quorum. Because executives didn't meet quorum, there was a lot of motions that didn't go through and had to be postponed to a future meeting. She also brought up some points about how people losing in elections has nothing to do with an accountability policy, and it has to do with ensuring that future boards don't experience the same challenges as previous boards. The Senate representative Priya McMurtry said she doesn't understand the rationale behind this decision because it sounds like this is being taken as an attack from the previous board as a result of the elections. She basically said if their reason for not supporting this is that the previous board did it for some political motivation and they did it in their last board meeting, that they should have passed it sooner. If they should have passed this policy sooner instead of at the last board meeting, why doesn't the current board pass it now? When the last board passed this, they didn't give any rationale in the memorandum. However, they did experience a lot of issues with quorum, so it's likely this policy was passed due to the issues they experienced with board members not showing up and decisions being delayed because of people not attending. Some points that were brought up by a guest, a former board member, Abhijit Rai. He said that the rationale says the critics aren't selected by the last board. However, they're actually selected by the Alumni Advisory Committee. And the terms of reference for the Alumni Advisory Committee says that's made up of one member of the CapU Alumni Association, 3 former student leaders selected by the president, and 3 former student leaders selected by the executive director. So these are no longer current students who are being appointed to the Alumni Advisory Committee. The applications for the executive portfolio critic positions were also available for all students to apply to, and the Alumni Advisory Committee is the one who will consider these applications. The executive portfolio critics have no power to move motions or vote, they just have speaking rights. In the terms for the critic positions, it says that no student leader who served as an executive is eligible to be an executive portfolio critic. And the executive portfolio critics would provide opportunities for more students to get involved. The issues with attendance experienced by the last board led to several directors being removed. This is likely why the remaining directors decided to make an accountability policy. At the last board meeting, there were changes made to the attendance policy so that 6 board members, including 2 executives, don't lose pay or get removed. The VP Finance and the president has full attendance, but the other board members do not. The executive portfolio critics cannot be a roadblock because they have not been appointed yet. So far in your term, everything is primarily based on elections, and you should be focusing more on student engagement. If you appoint critics, they have no power. If it was part of politics, they would have full power, but the only power they have is the right to speak, as I do. So that was a quote from one of the guests, Abhijit Rai, a former board member. There was a suggestion brought up by the queer student liaison, Divyansh Saini, who suggested that instead of abolishing the executive portfolio critics altogether, we implement a trial period where for 6 months we have the executive portfolio critics, and then this policy comes back to the board in 6 months from now to evaluate the usefulness of these positions. This was supported by the Board of Governors representative Sophia Cara because it would allow for the board to see if these roadblocks would come to fruition or not. The president objected to the suggestion of a 6-month trial period and said he wanted the voting to be done as stated in the agenda, and said if this was delayed for 6 months, then it would be close to the end of their term. In response to what the president said, The Senate Representative Priya McMurtry said she doesn't understand the logic of why the president is not willing to try a trial period for the executive portfolio critics and stated that there's no harm in having them. She said the fear of accountability is a major concern and the 6-month trial period is a good idea. In response to the president's concerns that a 6-month trial period would end close to the end of their term, Divyansh suggested reducing the timeline for the trial period. In response to the president's concerns that a 6-month trial period would be close to the end of their term, the queer student liaison Divyansh suggested to reduce the timeline for the trial period, and the Senate Representative Sarang Singh suggested a 2-month trial period. The at-large Representative Yuvraj suggested closing the debate and opening voting for if the board will adopt the trial period or not. Adopting the 6-month trial period was voted down by a 2/3 vote, with 6 in favor and 12 opposed. Possibility of having a trial period was shot down, and the conversation returned to the original motion of getting rid of the executive portfolio critics. When the president was asked to explain why he feels that this was a political decision, he said that 50% of the Alumni Advisory Committee were appointed by the last president, so they'll have the majority and do what they want to. 3 members of the Alumni Advisory Committee were appointed by the former president, and 3 were appointed by the executive director. Later in the conversation, in response to Angad's points about the Alumni Advisory Committee, Abhijit Rai said that for the executive portfolio critic positions, no former executives can apply for it. Only non-executive former board members can apply for it, and regular students. The former president selected 3 alumni committee members because it was newly created. So when this policy decision was made, it was first brought up at the governance committee before going to the executive committee and going to the board. So it went through a lot of different conversations and discussions before they decided to pass this policy to create the Alumni Advisory Committee and the executive portfolio critic positions. One of the guests at this meeting spoke and said that today's board members will also be alumni eventually, and they'll be able to use their experience to help the CSU later. The president, Angad Brar, agreed that the Alumni Advisory Committee is important, so they aren't abolishing the Alumni Advisory Committee. The Arts and Science Representative, Sanchit, was for abolishing these positions because there are already accountability mechanisms in place in the CSU, and he feels it'll create blocks, slow down decision-making, and create unnecessary bureaucracy. It could foster a hostile environment in the CSU, it could affect teamwork and trust, and in the future, it could lead to inconsistency of accountability instead of improving it. And it could also impact executives' ability to do their duties confidently and effectively. The VP External, Arpan, made a point about how the executives play an informal role as a critic for the other executives. The queer student liaison, Divyansh Saini, spoke again and said he still feels a 6-month trial period is enough because by the end of March, this board will still be here, but suggested a 3-month trial period for the critics instead of 6 months, and suggested that if the board isn't getting common ground, that this should be recommended to the committee again for further discussion. The Senate Representative Sarang emphasized what Sanchit said, saying that there are already mechanisms in place, students are attending the CSU board meetings as guests, and that every year there's a new board with new ideas, and if anyone has criticisms or things to say, they can come into the board meetings and talk about what they have to say. The board only has 1 year to accomplish a bunch of things, and 6 months is a huge time to think about small things, pushing problems, and decision making. The VP Finance, Suksol, made a point saying, how can we make a conclusion about the executive portfolio critics when it hasn't even happened yet? She asked, why aren't we being optimistic? Why aren't we thinking about it in a positive way? Why are there negative thoughts about this? It will delay things when they have no voting power. For every executive portfolio, there will be 1 member. So there will be a person beside us who will be supporting them. If there are 2 minds, we can get better ideas. The Fine Arts Representative, Shruti Kardakia, agreed that a 3-month trial period would be good and put forward a motion to postpone for 3 months, and it was seconded by Sophia Kara. There were 7 in favor of the 3-month trial period. However, the motion failed because the majority voted against this. When speaking again, the Arts and Science Representative Sanchit Kaura said the critics don't need to have voting power to harm accountability. You just need to speak. At the last board meeting, we had students act as critics and the motion did not pass, and it was the least efficient meeting we've had at the CSU this year. If students want to say something, they still have the power to say something, and do petitions and many more opportunities the CSU provides. The reason why he thinks it won't work is because we are not the ones who came up with this idea. It's been in the history, and the reason why all of the Board of Governors, Senate, faculty unions, and student unions across Canada, no one else in Canada has this system of executive portfolio critics because it's not a good thing. So it's a negative point for our union, and we shouldn't waste any more time on this because it's a waste of students' time. So this conversation lasted more than 30 minutes and eventually moved to a vote. So the executive portfolio critic positions were abolished with a 13-5 vote. So you can see here exactly how the Board of Directors voted on abolishing the accountability policy. Some of the directors wanted their vote noted in the minutes. So that is Suksol, Priya, and Sophia. They voted nay, and Divyansh abstained from this vote. So this vote passed 13-5, so the board accountability policy is now effectively abolished, but the Alumni Advisory Committee is still in effect. There were 3 items on notices, which means this will be discussed at the next board meeting. So that's executive engagement hours. So the changes that are being proposed are getting rid of executive office hours and replacing that with tabling hours around campus. The next item is the arbitration panel and the election procedures. And the next item is regulating anonymous elections complaints. These are the items that will be discussed at the next CSU board meeting. And we will be making a video in 2 weeks from now to let you know exactly what happens about these decisions.